and white trash talking.
Hi, I'm Doug Johnson, and I'm White Trash Talking. Today I want to look at a new war front that the U.S. has opened against Russia and China. I'm talking about the Arctic and the new so-called Polar Silk Road that is opening up on Russia's northern coastline, made possible by the receding ice glaciers. Here's a short clip by CBC, a Canadian news outlet, that summarizes this emerging battlefield.
The Arctic is undergoing a transformation. It's driven by global warming and intense global competition.
Global tensions find a new stage in the warming Arctic.
Tonight, the U.S. closely monitoring growing military cooperation between Russia and China.
The Arctic is no longer a low-tension region.
You've got the incoming U.S. president calling the Arctic a top priority and promising to drill for oil and gas. And Russia and China working together on what they call a Polar Silk Road. The Arctic is opening up. These thick blocks of ice are melting, clearing the way for ships to travel through. According to the Canadian government, by 2050, the Arctic Ocean will become an increasingly viable shipping route between Europe and Asia during the summer. That's a big deal because right now, the fastest way to ship goods from Europe to Asia is through the Suez Canal in Egypt. But as we've seen more and more, the Suez Canal is not always the most reliable route. So what if, instead of going down south and passing through the Middle East, you could go north and use the Arctic Ocean as a shortcut across the globe? There are essentially two ways you could do this. One is using what's known as the Northwest Passage. This would take you through the Arctic on the North American side, weaving through Canada's northern archipelagos. The other route through the Arctic is known as the Northern Sea Route. This one passes through the Russian side of the Arctic Ocean, along the Siberian coastline. Both of these routes offer a much shorter path between Europe and Asia than the Suez Canal. It shaves off up to 5,000 kilometers. That's a third of the trip, or up to a full week of travel. The Arctic is full of untapped gold, nickel, copper, diamonds, platinum, and researchers believe it's holding about 90 billion barrels of oil and 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas. Russia has, by far, the largest share of Arctic territory. Almost a quarter of its territory is north of the Arctic Circle, and it controls 24,000 kilometers of Arctic coastline. Between January and March of 2024, NATO conducted its biggest joint military exercise since the Cold War, called Steadfast Defender 24. One of its main focuses, the Arctic. 20,000 soldiers, 50-plus ships, more than 100 aircraft from 13 countries were involved in these Arctic drills. Russia took this as a provocation.
This map shows the 8 countries of the Arctic: Russia, the US, Canada, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. All but Russia are NATO members, with Finland and Sweden joining in 2023 and 2024, respectively. The Northern Sea Route, as the intro mentioned, which is marked in blue here, reduces the travel distance by 5,000 kilometers and travel time by a full week. It allows China to avoid the Suez Canal, which is circled on the left, but also the Strait of Malacca, where China must pass through, all countries must pass through in their shipping route. And it's the strait that the US has threatened to blockade in their eventual attack on China, which, as I mentioned in my previous episodes, the US is currently planning. Before going further, it's important to take a wider perspective of what the US is up to. The US has created an arc of crisis to surround Russia. In addition to putting NATO into the Arctic, the US is currently attacking Russia through its proxy, Ukraine. The US has opened a front in Iran to gain footholds against both Russia and China. The US has begun agitating in the South Caucasus, in Azerbaijan, Armenia, and Georgia to advance NATO into Russia's so-called underbelly. And in Europe, the US has turned the historically neutral countries, Sweden and Finland, into US vassals to serve as proxies of aggression along Russia's northwestern border. Moreover, the U.S. has promulgated fear among Europeans of a Russian attack. Despite the fact that Russia has never attacked Norway, it's been 300 years since Russia's Great Northern War against Sweden, and 80 years since the war against Finland, when Finland was aligned with Nazi Germany. The primary dispute now is the fact that NATO, which is essentially an extension of the U.S. military, is expanding eastward, in violation of promises never to do so, right up to the Russian border. Russia rejects this, just as the U.S. would reject the Russian or Chinese military in Mexico. This is entirely what the Russian invasion of Ukraine is about, and why Russia rejects NATO exercises in the Arctic. This is basic logic. But where does this intense U.S. hostility towards Russia come from? Before looking at the Arctic and the Polar Silk Road, here's Jeffrey Sachs, a professor at Columbia University, economist, and public policy analyst, to describe a core policy of the U.S.'s deep state going back more than 80 years.
The deep state means the permanent security system of the United States of America. And that, since 1947, when it was established, has been organized to defeat Russia. That has been a primary objective. Now, I would say the primary objective of the deep state is to defeat Russia and China. That's the deep state. And the deep state looks at the chessboard, like Brzezinski did in the Grand Chessboard in 1997 in his book. And he sees, the deep state sees every part of the board as part of this game. And it is viewed as a game, that this is strategy. And we have to put our pieces in different places, our military bases in different places, our color revolutions, our coups. So it's a game for them, like a video game. It's a long distance combat where nothing gets too personal for them. So they are ready to squander places if it weakens their enemy. Remember, what's the goal of the Ukraine war? It is to weaken Russia. It's to weaken Russia, with Ukraine throwing millions of lives into the cauldron. But that's the idea. So the deep state has an overriding objective, and that is American primacy. And American primacy is threatened by other large powers. So we should provoke, extend, antagonize Russia. And we can do it through the neighboring region. And this is how the U.S. is regarding China, and it's how the U.S. is regarding Russia. Because we're trying to destabilize Russia, keep it on the back foot, prevent it from having economic development, prevent it from developing normal economic relations. Ukraine is ablaze because of United States and European stupidity. It is the long-standing practice of the CIA to meddle around Russia's periphery. And that is what is happening right now. So just be careful not to be played.
Western Europe, unfortunately, is being played. They've become subservient to the U.S. But how could the U.S. manipulate Europe, instill a deep fear of Russia, and sell the preposterous idea to join NATO and wage war alongside the U.S.? Here is Lawrence Wilkerson, retired colonel of the U.S. military and former chief of staff to U.S. Secretary of State Colin Powell, to answer that question.
In my administration, in George W. Bush's administration, we started buying newspapers, we started buying leaders, we started buying all manner of influential entities all across Europe so we could get people elected who would be favorable to ending years of neutrality, in the case of some of them, and becoming members of NATO. And then we stirred up Ukraine to put a little icing on the cake by making them afraid of Russia. This is also clear. This is what we've been doing for years now, in conjunction with MI6, and now very much so in conjunction with Mossad. So this strategy worked beautifully, but created chaos. It created what we wanted along that arc of crisis, if you will, because now China is looking at an abrupt stop to each branch of its Base Road Initiative caused by the United States and its allies.
The U.S.'s superiority in advertising and PR enables it to sell ideas that indoctrinate and manipulate people into behaving in ways that undermine their self-interests. This hatred and this fear have been manufactured, which is hard to believe, but it's true. We've all been played, especially Americans who are pumped full of this propaganda night and day through mainstream media. Colonel Wilkerson goes on to describe the U.S.'s control of the Arctic Council, the governing body of the Arctic region, as well as to summarize the current situation in the Arctic.
The Arctic Council now is being more or less used as a tool of the empire to keep people who we don't want to be active in the Arctic out of the council. The northern flank of NATO seemed to be extremely vulnerable if you really contemplated what Russia was doing on its northern rim. And what Russia was doing, Stalin had put a lot of equipment up there that was, shall we say, military or military oriented. Once the USSR evaporated, that went to hell. Well, I mean, almost overnight. It just went. You don't have to wait long for things in the Arctic to go to hell. Winter takes over really quickly. So that whole northern rim of what was the Soviet Union and turned into Russia was allowed to go to pot, particularly under Yeltsin. One of the things Putin has done is revive that to a fairly well. There are military installations up there now, scientific installations that are clearly being designed to monitor the Northwest Passage, which passes closest to and most formidably from a strategic point of view, Russia, because of its coastline and the way it abuts the Arctic. Canada has a lot of coastline too, but it doesn't have the kind of coastline that Russia has that's so conducive to interdiction, conducive to controlling it. There's even talk that the Russians might charge a tariff for passing along that stretch of water because it's in their economic zone. And they have the military power up there to enforce the implementation of such a tariff. We don't want that to happen. And so we're already up there. And we're up there with the Finns and the Norwegians because now they're, that kind of part of NATO. We're up there because they have icebreakers and we don't. We have one broken one and one that's been in port for about 2 years. I think Trump has put some billions of dollars into this $1 trillion plus defense budget to build some, but it takes a long time to build an icebreaker. And we don't do shipbuilding very well at all anymore. Another point, China does shipbuilding really well. Their defense industrial base dwarfs ours. Russia's now dwarfs ours. They can produce things that are necessary for defense a lot faster and a lot more extensively than we can. So we're in a situation right now where the Arctic is a theater of war, and we are treating it that way. And we're treating it that way because we think China and Russia have bad intentions in the Arctic, rather than working with them to do several things. One, ensure that Arctic is not raped, pillaged, and plundered, which many U.S. mining and oil and gas companies would love to do. And I'm sure Putin has a problem with that in his own country too, but he's got a little bit better handle on it. Two, we're thinking that there might be all manner of rare earth metals and other similar commodities that we need desperately on the Arctic seabed, and we might be right. Scientists are saying that that might be a good projection. And three, we're the enemy of everyone else that wants to do the Arctic in a sort of, amiable, diplomatic, let's do this because it's a benefit to humankind way. We want to have control over it. And we want the United States Navy to be able to manage that control, and the Coast Guard where it can. We're crazy, and we don't want anybody else interfering with it.
This map of resources shows the gas and oil fields throughout the Arctic, the bulk of it marked in purple, just off the Russian and Alaskan coastlines. The Arctic Basin is also believed to hold rare earth minerals, which has become an issue since China banned the export of gallium, germanium, and antimony in response to Trump's chip sanctions. Colonel Wilkerson said it best a moment ago. The U.S. is, quote, the enemy of everyone else that wants to do the Arctic in an amiable, diplomatic, let's do this because it's a benefit to humankind way, end quote. The U.S., like always, wants total control of the Arctic and the world. While there's enough to go around for everyone, I'm afraid that the U.S.'s maniacal drive for world hegemony will not cease until either one side or the other is destroyed, or, the option I prefer, the U.S. quits inventing enemies and the wars stop. Can you imagine that? Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe. Please leave a comment, and I'll see you next week. Bye.